I believe that it is very important that somehow or other, somehow, it may be possible to arrive at a new philosophy of international relations, which is based on the fact that neither capitalism nor communism will conquer.
The man speaking is not a politician, nor is he a retired general philosophizing on the world situation. He is a medical researcher, a scientist whose discoveries have benefited all mankind. But at the same time, he's a humanist, bound up in the fabric of man's future existence. This is his story, one of a fascinating man of action. We invite you now to meet Dr. Albert Sabin, the benefactor. On August 26, 1906, Albert Bruce Sabin is born near the town of Bialystok, then in western Russia. In 1920, the Sabin family leaves Europe, settles in Paterson, New Jersey, and Albert enters high school. His uncle, Sabin studies to be a dentist. The microbe hunters, and all that is changed. Rather than continue to accept his uncle's support, he takes a job, goes back to college, and later enters medical school. In 1931, he receives his MD from New York University. Ironically, it's a year when the city is gripped with one of its worst polio outbreaks. 2 years later, Dr. Albert Sabin takes out his first passport and is on his way to London as a National Research Council Fellow. His destination, the Lister Institute, located on the bank of the historic Thames. Sabin shares his flat in the artists section of London with a close friend. During 1934, he travels through Europe and Nazi Germany. In 1935, he becomes a member of the scientific staff at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York. At the Institute, he does research on various viruses, including polio. In 1939, he accepts a position with the Children's Hospital Research Foundation in Cincinnati. There, his work begins to focus intensely on polio research. Finances for much of his efforts come in the form of yearly checks from the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. Dr. Sabin's work with the Army's Epidemiological Board leads him to accept a major's commission in 1943. He continues work on vaccines for several exotic diseases that plague U.S. troops fighting in foreign lands. One of the disabling diseases he conquers is Japanese type B encephalitis, or sleeping sickness. In a tent laboratory in Okinawa, Dr. Sabin leads the fight to curb an epidemic plaguing the island. His work on a vaccine for this viral disease began in Cincinnati as early as Pearl Harbor and culminates in the inoculation of over 60,000 U.S. servicemen on Okinawa. For his wartime work, Dr. Sabin is awarded the Legion of Merit in 1945, just before his retirement from service. But retirement does not stop his work with the military. He remains a member of the Epidemiological Board and lectures frequently to Army doctors. With the war over, Dr. Sabin returns to an old project begun in 1931, research into the nature of the polio virus. 1947, the greatest polio epidemic in history hits Berlin. Amid the rubble, the disease spreads like wildfire. Dr. Sabin flies to help U.S. servicemen and the children of the stricken city. Back in the United States, Dr. Sabin again turns his attention to his old adversary, polio. He is convinced that the polio virus can maintain itself in nature only in human beings. He says, rob it of its soil for multiplication, and you eradicate it. In his Cincinnati lab, he starts the long search for a polio virus mutation, a strain too weak to produce polio, but strong enough to give immunity. He sets up a production line in his research laboratory, a virus breeding farm, he calls it. 2 years later, he has several safe viruses of each polio type ready for testing. Holding to tradition, Dr. Sabin and his co-workers are the first volunteers to swallow the vaccine. After 4 years of exhaustive tests with prison inmates, the vaccine is ready for field studies in the United States, Mexico, Russia, Malaya, and other countries. In 1959, mass trials involving millions of children over the world establish the vaccine's safety and effectiveness. Russia and her European satellites approve the vaccine for routine use and begin its manufacture in massive quantities. The U.S. Public Health Service approves his vaccine in August 1960, but American pharmaceutical companies are slow to start production. Meanwhile, Dr. Sabin is hailed as the rescuer of children by mothers in Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. Almost 2 years before the vaccine is first put in mass use in America, nearly 100 million children in Eastern Bloc countries swallow his oral product. Dr. Sabin and his vaccine have opened a wide gap in the Iron Curtain. Today, Dr. Albert Sabin's hair has turned a distinguished shade of gray, but his view of the role of a researcher has not changed.
In the first place, I don't think that there is any species that can be called researcher. If they have one thing in common, is that they have a great curiosity about some field of knowledge, that each one is very anxious to bring some additional new light where there was no light before, and that the rewards come usually in finding something new that hasn't been known before, and only rarely does it come in the acclaim of one's colleagues and the rewards that may follow from that.
At his suburban home, Albert Sabin's day normally begins at 6:30 a.m. with the reading of his morning paper. By 7:30, he's ready to take his teenage daughters, Deborah and Amy, to nearby Walnut Hills High School.
No, yeah, I guess so.
Just before 8 a.m., he arrives at the Children's Hospital Research Foundation, located in the midst of Cincinnati's sprawling medical complex. This building has been headquarters for his research activities since 1939, when he came here as chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases. He arrived with one major medical award to his credit, but otherwise he was virtually unknown. Today, he is one of the city's most famous and celebrated citizens. The first floor waiting room of the Research Foundation is still crowded with children and their parents seeking medical help. But their numbers are only a shadow of the thousands that flocked here during the mass polio vaccine tests of 1960. His staff, too, has diminished since those hectic days of his work on polio. And Albert Sabin has turned his research efforts in a new direction, toward unraveling the mysteries of cancer. But one thing has not changed. He still has room on his reduced staff for a young associate who one day he may call his scientific son.
Well, over the years, I've had a number of different people work with me, some from this country and some from various countries abroad. And they come with different degrees of training. And I make it my business to always work very closely with them, at least for a time, until I can imbue in them a certain critical approach and certain ways of thinking and approaching their work. And then I do like for them to go off on their own. And it is one of my gratifications at my age now that I have people in this country, as well as abroad, whom I can honestly call my scientific sons, about whose work and accomplishments I feel very proud, particularly because of the hope that in some small way I influence their development. And there's a definite zone of growth.
Dr. Giulio Taro, a young researcher from Naples, Italy, is Dr. Sabin's current candidate.
He came without too much previous training, And I'm really enjoying to see how beautifully he's working out. And I think he's going to be another son. I'm going to have an Italian one, too.
In his current work, Dr. Sabin is no longer looking for a vaccine to eliminate a specific medical problem, as was the case with polio. Since 1964, he has investigated one of the most difficult problems facing virologists today, the possible role of viruses in human cancer. In an area that once housed hundreds of monkeys and chimps for his polio work, Dr. Sabin makes a daily check on the progress of tumors growing on a number of hamsters.
At the present time, I'm engaged entirely in work on tumors that are produced experimentally by viruses, studying some of the basic phenomena involved in changing a normal cell into a cancerous cell by means of viruses, and then seeing whether or not the phenomena that one can discern in such a changed cell can be found in human cancers.
Achievement of international fame has its price. A never-ending flood of requests for information pours into Dr. Sabin's office.
All right. This letter will go to Professor Veligor Gligorich, President, Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and you'll find the address on here.
The files outside his office door recall a career of medical research spanning almost 40 years. The history of endless research and testing, countless trips to symposia, and to aid in the administration of vaccine. These shelves tell that story. A large file of microscope slides contains tissue samples from more than 14,000 monkeys and chimps used in research on the polio vaccine that today protects the lives of children all over the world. Albert Sabin's busy schedule rarely allows much time for lunch. By eating in, he can begin writing up the results of some of his work.
One of the most important things in scientific work is to write it up. Write it up in a way that makes sense, and that takes a great deal of time.
On the floor below, medical students are already congregating for a special lecture.
I am a research professor and have no official teaching duties. But every year I give 3 or 4 lectures to medical students during the course in pediatrics.
Although his contact with medical students is minimal, he tries to encourage them. For Dr. Sabin, there's always something new to tell, but never the end. It is now 6 p.m., and the Research Foundation's library is deserted. Dr. Sabin stops by to check the latest medical publications for articles related to his work. His role in the vast field of medical research is best summed up by the ageless philosophy of Aristotle.
Real grandeur is never the product of the work of any one man. That any one man can contribute but a little to the total knowledge, and that the real grandeur comes from the work of everyone, from the assembled facts of everyone.
One of the most familiar scenes in Albert Sabin's busy life is reenacted almost every week.
American Airlines Astrojet Flight 342, nonstop from New York, by the John F. Kennedy International Airport, departing
abroad are connected with invitations to give lectures, or again, international congresses or international symposia. I believe that all of this work is significant and enriches my life, so that I don't feel that when I'm away from the laboratory that I'm doing something that I shouldn't.
Typical of the lectures Dr. Sabin is asked to make in foreign countries is a talk at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. In his audience are two French doctors who will go on to win the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Dr. Sabin's concern for the areas of the world plagued with poverty led him to join with 29 other distinguished humanitarians in Rome to sign a declaration decrying man's common enemy, hunger. In this country and abroad, his travels bring him in contact with political leaders on all levels. But he always seems to have time to talk about his career and his philosophy. Few Americans know the nature of the Russian people as well as Dr. Sabin. Work with his vaccine made him one of the first Americans after World War II to travel extensively in Russia. One of his many visits to the Russian Polio Research Center in Moscow is recorded with Dr. Sabin's own camera. His host is longtime friend, Professor Mikhail Chumikov. Later, the two spend time relaxing on the Volga River. Requests for Dr. Sabin to make television appearances come from virtually every country he visits. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a large panel interviews him about his current work. In Rio de Janeiro, the country's first elementary school to be named for a living individual is dedicated in his honor. Months later, in Siena, Italy, another dedication. The Albert Sabin laboratories are open for the production of oral polio vaccine. Of the new facilities, Sabin comments, "They make my lab look like a barn." A year later in the state of Israel, the Albert Sabin woodland is dedicated. Planted largely with funds donated by citizens of Cincinnati, the new forest covers the barren slopes near another memorial planting named for John F. Kennedy. Dr. Sabin's schedule gives him little time for recreation. Under the nighttime sky, he does a Jewish folk dance with some young Israelis. On a lecture trip to Yugoslavia, Dr. Sabin is honored with a special award. Marshal Tito then arranges an unexpected meeting.
President Tito had made arrangements to see me in what was to be perhaps a very formal thing for a minute or two, in which he was supposed to express his gratitude for my help to Yugoslavia, and the elimination of poliomyelitis quickly turned into a discussion of world problems, of Yugoslavia, and the particular kind of new economic and social philosophy they were working out, and I talked for an hour with Tito, which was a very interesting experience for me too.
Confer the degree of Doctor of Science honoris causa upon Albert Bruce Sabin.
During his long career, scores of honors have been conferred on Albert Sabin. These include honorary membership in some 12 medical and scientific societies. In 1951, he was elected to the elite National Academy of Sciences. In these 1965 award ceremonies at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, Dr. Sabin receives his 11th honorary doctorate. He has also received a number of important awards and prizes. In Rome, he receives the $40,000 Antonio Faltrinelli Prize in Medical and Surgical Science. Recently, his home state of Ohio gave him its Governor's Award. Earlier, an Albert Sabin Day was proclaimed in recognition of his work. But in Dr. Sabin's file, there is a simple telegram which he values above many more formal honors, because he felt a particular kinship for its signer. And yet another facet of Albert Sabin's life, a lecture to a local women's club.
Friends in Cincinnati whom I've not yet had an opportunity to come to know. I want to tell you that I'm very specially honored and delighted by the fact that you asked me to come and speak to you. Because I think esteem of one's neighbors is really worth a great deal more than the esteem of strangers who don't know you so well.
Dr. Sabin has
People who are
time to
engaged
accept
in
very
science
few speaking
have as their
invitations.
objective to
But when he does,
increase
his
our
audience is
knowledge
never bored with the latest in news from the land.
the world around us, and by doing that, I think they are doing a very important thing. Now, when a scientist, whether he be a medical scientist or something else, also as a humanist, a humanitarian, that then he becomes very much concerned about the application of the ever-increasing knowledge that is being developed now at an extraordinary rate, not merely to be put on shelves as works of art or in a museum to give us an intellectual delight in what the human mind can uncover, but to give us tools with which to make life better, more dignified, richer, and more worth living, not just for a few, but for as many as possible, and preferably all.
Like medical conventions, you know, when everybody's talking shop and you're talking.
To Albert Sabin, it is never either or, neither black nor white, neither socialist nor capitalist. In science and in human society, for him there exists a vast spectrum of choice, both in medical research and in life itself. Albert Sabin's own words best express his philosophy. If we once grant that we do not live for ourselves alone, then the concern for problems facing mankind in general in this world is perhaps of the utmost importance.